I never imagined that a 40-foot aluminum pole in my backyard would trigger the most surreal legal battle of my life. But when Barbara Henderson from the Oakmont Hills HOA showed up at my door with her clipboard and pursed lips, I knew I was in for a fight. It started on a Saturday morning in June 2025 when I was adjusting my new Yaesu FT 991A transceiver in my home office. I had spent the last 3 months getting my general class amateur radio license, studying every night after my shift at the data center in Phoenix, Arizona. The exam was brutal, but I passed on my first try, and I was eager to finally join the worldwide community of ham radio operators. My call sign, KE7JMV, was freshly printed on my license certificate hanging above my desk. The antenna installation happened 2 weeks before Barbara's visit. I hired a professional crew to install a proper tower with a beam antenna, all according to code and properly grounded. The setup cost me nearly $8,000, but it was worth it. Within days, I made contacts with operators in Japan, Australia, and even a research station in Antarctica. The hobby was everything I hoped it would be. I was in the middle of a conversation with a fellow operator in New Zealand when my doorbell rang. Through the window, I could see a woman in her mid-50s with blonde highlights and a cream-colored blazer standing on my porch. She held a leather-bound folder against her chest like a shield. "Can I help you?" I asked after opening the door. "James Vance?" Her voice was clipped and professional, the kind that suggested she was used to being obeyed. "That's me. I'm Barbara Henderson, president of the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association. I need to discuss a serious violation with you." My stomach dropped. I had read the HOA bylaws when I bought the house 18 months ago, but they were vague about outdoor structures. I figured I was in the clear since nothing explicitly mentioned radio antennas. "What violation?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She opened her folder and pulled out a printed photograph of my property. Someone had taken it from the street, clearly showing my antenna tower rising above the roofline. This monstrosity," she said, tapping the photo with a manicured fingernail. "It's an eyesore and completely unacceptable. Section 12, paragraph 4 of our community guidelines explicitly states that no structure may extend more than 15 feet above the roofline of any residence." "I wasn't aware of that specific clause," I said, "but I'm operating under federal protection. Amateur radio antennas are covered by FCC regulations that supersede local restrictions." Barbara's expression didn't change. "Federal law or not, Mr. Vance, you signed an agreement when you purchased this property. That antenna comes down, or we'll take legal action." "I think you should check with your attorney before making threats," I replied, my jaw tightening. "The FCC has been very clear about this issue. HOAs cannot prohibit amateur radio antennas." "We'll see about that." She tucked the photo back into her folder. "You have 30 days to remove the structure. Consider this your official notice." She turned and walked back to her white Lexus SUV, leaving me standing in the doorway with my heart pounding. I closed the door and immediately went to my computer, pulling up the FCC regulations I had bookmarked months ago. PRB1, the federal preemption rule, was explicit. State and local regulations must reasonably accommodate amateur radio communications, and private land use agreements must do the same. I spent the rest of the day researching similar cases. There were dozens of them scattered across the country, ham radio operators fighting their HOAs over antenna restrictions. Most of them won, but the process was expensive and time-consuming. I didn't have the money for a lengthy legal battle, but I also wasn't going to back down from someone who thought a clipboard gave her the authority to ignore federal law. The next morning, I called my friend Derek Mitchell, who had been a ham operator for 20 years. He lived in Scottsdale and had dealt with his own HOA disputes. "They're bluffing," Derek said when I explained the situation. "Barbara, what's her name, is probably just used to people rolling over when she shows up. File a response citing PRB1 and send her copies of the relevant FCC regulations. 9 times out of 10, they'll back off once they realize you know your rights. And if they don't back off, then you contact the ARRL legal team. They have resources for exactly this kind of situation. Trust me, James, you're on solid legal ground here." I thanked him and spent the next few hours drafting a formal response. I cited PRB1, referenced multiple court cases where HOAs had lost similar battles, and explained the importance of amateur radio for emergency communications. I printed 3 copies, sent one via certified mail to Barbara Henderson, delivered one to the HOA management office, and kept one for my records. 2 weeks passed without a response. I began to think Derek was right and they were backing down. Then, on a Thursday evening, I found another letter in my mailbox. This one was from a law firm in Tempe, representing the Oakmont Hills HOA. The letter demanded immediate removal of the antenna and threatened daily fines of $200 until I complied. I read the letter twice, anger building in my chest. They weren't backing down at all. They were escalating. The next morning, I called the American Radio Relay League and spoke with a volunteer attorney named Patricia Collins. She listened to my story without interrupting, asking occasional questions about the timeline and the specific language in the HOA bylaws. "You have a strong case," she said when I finished. "PRB1 is federal law, and courts have consistently sided with amateur operators in these disputes. However, I need to warn you that this could get expensive. HOAs sometimes dig in their heels because they have deep pockets and don't like being challenged. What do you recommend? Send them another letter, this time from an attorney. I can connect you with someone in Phoenix who specializes in these cases. If that doesn't work, you may need to file for declaratory relief in federal court." She gave me the contact information for an attorney named Robert Chen. I called him that afternoon and scheduled a consultation for the following Monday. Robert's office was in downtown Phoenix, a modest suite on the 4th floor of a glass building. He was younger than I expected, probably in his early 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a firm handshake. "I've handled 3 of these cases in the last 2 years, he said after I sat down. 2 settled before trial, and 1 went to a judge who ruled in favor of my client. The legal precedent is overwhelmingly on your side. So why are they pushing this? Because HOAs are run by volunteers who often don't understand the limits of their authority. They think their bylaws are supreme law within the community, and they don't like being told otherwise. Barbara Henderson probably genuinely believes she has the right to make you take down that antenna." "What's this going to cost me?" Robert leaned back in his chair. "I can send them a demand letter for $500. If they don't back down and we have to file in federal court, you're looking at anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000, depending on how far they want to take it." I felt sick. I didn't have $15,000 sitting around, but I also couldn't let them bully me into giving up my rights. "Send the letter," I said. "Let's see if that scares them off." Robert drafted a comprehensive legal letter that afternoon. It cited PRB1, multiple court cases, and FCC regulations. It explained that the HOA's bylaws were unenforceable as applied to amateur radio antennas and demanded that they withdraw their threats immediately. The letter was professional but firm, exactly what I needed. Barbara's response came 4 days later, and it was not what I expected. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting and voted to begin assessing the $200 daily fines immediately. They also filed a lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court seeking an injunction to force removal of the antenna. "Tadar! They're making a mistake," Robert said when I forwarded him the lawsuit. "They filed in state court, but this is a federal issue. We'll file a motion to dismiss and simultaneously file our own action in federal court." The next 6 weeks were a blur of legal paperwork, court filings, and mounting stress. I kept operating my radio station, making contacts and participating in emergency nets, but the joy had been sucked out of the hobby. Every time I sat down at my radio, I thought about the legal battle hanging over my head. The HOA continued assessing fines. By August, they claimed I owed them over $8,000. I refused to pay, knowing that doing so might be construed as accepting their authority over my antenna. In mid-August, Robert successfully got the state court case dismissed, and our federal case was assigned to Judge Helen Morrison in the United States District Court for the District of Arizona. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for September 15th. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood became increasingly uncomfortable. Barbara had apparently told other residents about our dispute, and I started getting dirty looks when I checked my mail or took out the trash. One neighbor, a retired accountant named Frank, stopped me while I was getting groceries from my car. "You know, you're making trouble for everyone," he said. "Barbara's talking about raising HOA fees to pay for the legal costs, all because you want to keep that ugly tower." "All because Barbara doesn't understand federal law," I corrected. "I have every right to that antenna, and I'm not taking it down." "It's selfish," Frank muttered, walking away. I carried my groceries inside, fuming. It was incredible how people would side with the HOA without bothering to learn the facts. They saw Barbara as protecting property values, not recognizing that she was violating federal regulations and costing the association far more money than if she had just backed down in the first place. The preliminary hearing arrived on a clear September morning. I met Robert outside the courthouse, wearing my best suit and carrying a folder full of documentation. Barbara was there with the HOA's attorney, a severe-looking woman named Margaret Dunn, who looked like she ate nails for breakfast. Judge Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, with short gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose. She listened to opening statements from both sides, occasionally jotting notes on a legal pad. Margaret Dunn argued that HOA bylaws were legally binding contracts and that I had agreed to abide by them when I purchased the property. She claimed that allowing my antenna would set a dangerous precedent and undermine the HOA's ability to maintain community standards. Robert countered with PRB1 and a stack of case law. He explained that federal law explicitly preempted restrictive covenants regarding amateur radio antennas and that the FCC had ruled on this issue multiple times. Judge Morrison asked several pointed questions, particularly about whether the HOA bylaws contained any specific language about radio antennas. Margaret admitted they did not, which prompted the judge to raise an eyebrow. "So you're attempting to apply a general height restriction to a federally protected activity?" Judge Morrison asked. "The bylaws apply to all structures," Margaret replied. "We don't believe amateur radio antennas should be exempt." "Well, Ms. Dunn, what you believe and what federal law states are two different things." Judge Morrison closed her folder. "I'm going to take this under advisement, but I'll tell you right now that the plaintiff appears to have a very strong case. I suggest your clients consider settlement." We left the courthouse feeling cautiously optimistic. Robert warned me not to celebrate yet, but he seemed confident we would prevail. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Barbara Henderson. The subject line read, "Settlement Proposal." The email was surprisingly conciliatory. Barbara wrote that the HOA board had discussed the matter and was willing to allow the antenna to remain if I agreed to paint it a neutral color to minimize its visual impact and to relocate it 10 feet further from the property line. I called Robert immediately. "It's a trap," he said after I read him the email. "They're trying to get you to agree to restrictions that you don't legally have to accept. If you agree to move the antenna, you're implicitly accepting their authority to regulate it. Don't respond without running it by me first." I drafted a counterproposal stating that I would be willing to paint the antenna to match the surrounding environment, but I would not relocate it as it was already in the optimal position for my needs and met all setback requirements. I also insisted that the HOA withdraw all fines and acknowledge in writing that my antenna was protected under federal law. Barbara's response was swift and angry. She accused me of being unreasonable and unwilling to compromise. She claimed the HOA was trying to find a middle ground, and I was being obstinate. I didn't respond. Robert had advised me to let him handle all further communications, and I was happy to do so. In early October, Judge Morrison issued her ruling. It was a complete victory. She granted our motion for declaratory relief, ruling that PRB1 preempted the HOA's bylaws as applied to my amateur radio antenna. She ordered the HOA to cease all enforcement actions, rescind all fines, and refrain from any future attempts to restrict the antenna. The written opinion was 12 pages long and thoroughly dismantled every argument the HOA had made. Judge Morrison noted that federal policy strongly supported amateur radio operations and that HOAs could not use general bylaws to circumvent federal protections. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I called Robert to thank him, and he congratulated me on the win. "This is going to be precedent for other cases in Arizona," he said. "You did a good thing by fighting this." But the story didn't end there. Barbara Henderson was not the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. 2 weeks after the court ruling, I received a notice that the HOA was conducting a special assessment of my property. They claimed my yard needed significant landscaping improvements and were demanding I hire a professional landscaper within 30 days or face fines. I took photographs of my yard, which was well maintained with regular mowing and trimming. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. I sent the photos to Robert along with the notice. "They're retaliating," Robert said. "This is illegal. We can file a motion for sanctions." He sent a strongly worded letter to the HOA's attorney, pointing out that retaliatory actions following a federal court ruling could result in serious consequences for the board members personally. He cited cases where HOA board members had been held personally liable for harassment and retaliation. The landscaping demand was quietly withdrawn, but Barbara wasn't done. Over the next month, I received notices about my mailbox allegedly being the wrong color, my house numbers being improperly positioned, and my garbage cans being visible from the street on non-collection days. Each complaint was photographically documented and proven false, but it was exhausting dealing with the constant harassment. In November, I filed a formal complaint with the FCC. I documented all of Barbara's actions, the original demand to remove the antenna, the lawsuit, and the subsequent retaliation. I explained that the HOA president was engaging in a pattern of harassment designed to punish me for exercising my rights under federal law. The FCC took complaints about interference with amateur radio operations seriously. An investigator named Thomas Warren contacted me within 2 weeks. He reviewed all my documentation and interviewed me by phone for over an hour. "What you're describing is exactly the kind of behavior PRB1 was designed to prevent," Thomas said. "I'm going to send a formal inquiry to your HOA and their legal counsel. They need to understand that continued harassment of a licensed amateur radio operator can result in federal penalties." The FCC's letter arrived at the HOA office in early December. It was, by all accounts, scathing. Thomas had detailed every instance of harassment and retaliation, cited federal regulations, and warned that continued interference could result in substantial fines and potential criminal charges if they were found to be willfully violating federal law. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Barbara resigned as HOA president 3 days after receiving the letter. According to neighborhood gossip, the rest of the board had demanded her resignation, terrified of the potential legal and financial consequences of her crusade against my antenna. The new HOA president was a mild-mannered engineer named Paul Rodriguez, who lived 2 streets over. His first official act was to send me a formal apology letter, stating that the HOA recognized my right to maintain my amateur radio antenna and would not interfere with it in any way. He also confirmed that all previously assessed fines had been permanently rescinded. I accepted the apology, but remained wary. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. In January 2026, I received an unexpected visitor. Thomas Warren, the FCC investigator, wanted to see my station in person. He was a ham operator himself, holding an extra class license, and we spent a pleasant afternoon discussing radio equipment and comparing notes on distant contacts. "Your case is probably going to be used as a training example," Thomas said as he examined my antenna through binoculars from my backyard. "It's a textbook instance of HOA overreach and the proper way to fight back. You did everything right." "I couldn't have done it without good legal help," I said. "True, but a lot of people would have just given up. They would have taken the antenna down and walked away. By standing your ground, you've made it easier for the next ham operator who faces this situation." Thomas filed a formal report with the FCC concluding that the Oakmont Hills HOA had violated federal regulations and engaged in prohibited interference with amateur radio operations. The report recommended that the HOA be monitored for any future violations and that board members receive mandatory training on federal preemption laws. But there was one more twist in the story. In February, I learned through the neighborhood grapevine that Barbara Henderson was facing personal legal trouble. Apparently, during her tenure as HOA president, she had been approving payments to a landscaping company owned by her brother-in-law. The company was charging significantly above market rates, and Barbara was allegedly receiving kickbacks. Several homeowners, angry about rising HOA fees, had started investigating the association's finances. What they found was disturbing. Over the past 3 years, the landscaping company had been paid over $200,000, roughly double what comparable services should have cost. There were also questionable expenditures for consulting services and community improvements that never seemed to materialize. A group of homeowners filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Corporation Commission and contacted the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Within weeks, a full investigation was underway. I wasn't directly involved in the financial investigation, but I was interviewed as part of the broader inquiry into Barbara's conduct. I described the harassment, the retaliatory enforcement actions, and her refusal to accept the federal court ruling. The investigators seemed very interested in establishing a pattern of behavior. In March, Barbara Henderson was arrested and charged with theft, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The arrest was covered by local news, and I watched the broadcast with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I'd never wanted anyone to go to jail. I just wanted to operate my radio station in peace. But Barbara's corruption went far beyond our dispute over my antenna. She had betrayed the trust of everyone in the neighborhood, stealing from the community she claimed to serve. The legal proceedings moved quickly. Barbara's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutors had a strong case. Bank records showed regular payments from the landscaping company to an account in her name, and there were emails discussing how to hide the arrangement from other board members. In May 2026, almost exactly a year after Barbara first knocked on my door, she pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for agreeing to make full restitution to the HOA and accept a sentence of 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. The Oakmont Hills HOA underwent significant changes in the aftermath. Paul Rodriguez implemented new financial controls and transparency measures. All contracts over $5,000 now required competitive bids and approval from a majority of homeowners, not just the board. Monthly financial statements were posted online for all residents to review. The HOA also formally updated its bylaws to explicitly recognize federal preemption for amateur radio antennas and other federally protected activities. The new language made clear that while the association maintained reasonable aesthetic standards, those standards could not be used to prohibit activities protected by federal law. As for me, I continued operating my radio station without interference. My antenna became something of a neighborhood landmark, and several residents even expressed interest in getting their own ham radio licenses. I ended up mentoring 3 new operators, helping them study for their exams and learn the basics of the hobby. Derek, my friend who had encouraged me to fight the HOA in the first place, came over one Saturday in June to help me upgrade my antenna system. We were adding a new rotor and improving the ground plane. You could have avoided all this drama if you'd just taken the antenna down," Derek said as we worked. "Yeah, but then I wouldn't be able to talk to people in Antarctica," I replied. "And Barbara would still be stealing from the HOA, and nobody would know about it." True. Sometimes standing up for your rights has unexpected benefits. We finished the installation as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my backyard. The new antenna performed beautifully, and that evening I made contacts with operators in Brazil, South Africa, and Alaska. Each contact reminded me why I had fought so hard to keep my station. The legal battle cost me roughly $12,000 in attorney fees, even with the favorable outcome. It was money I hadn't planned to spend, but I never regretted it. Some fights are worth the cost, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. I thought a lot about Barbara during those months. What made someone so determined to exert control over others? Was it just power for its own sake? Or was there something deeper? Maybe she genuinely believed she was protecting the neighborhood, unable to see that she was actually harming it. Or maybe the corruption came first, and the authoritarian approach to the HOA was just a symptom of a larger character flaw. I would never know for sure. After her sentencing, Barbara and her husband moved out of Oakmont Hills. I heard they relocated to California, where presumably Barbara would have to find new outlets for her need to control others. The whole experience taught me several valuable lessons. First, that standing up to bullies is important even when it's expensive and stressful. Second, that federal law exists for a reason, and regulatory agencies like the FCC take their mandates seriously. Third, that HOAs can be a breeding ground for petty tyranny if residents don't stay vigilant and hold their leaders accountable. I also learned that communities are stronger when they embrace diversity, including different hobbies and interests. Amateur radio might seem like an obscure hobby to some people, but it serves a vital function during emergencies. When hurricanes knock out cell towers and internet connections fail, ham radio operators are often the only communication link for disaster-stricken areas. My antenna wasn't just a toy for talking to strangers around the world. It was part of a nationwide emergency communication network. In August, I was invited to speak at a regional ham radio convention in Tucson. The organizers had heard about my case and wanted me to share my experience with other operators. I was nervous about public speaking, but I felt obligated to help others who might face similar situations. The presentation went better than expected. I walked through the timeline of my dispute with the HOA, showed copies of the legal documents, and explained the key regulations in court cases. I emphasized the importance of knowing your rights, documenting everything, and getting good legal advice early in the process. During the question and answer session, one older gentleman raised his hand. Did you ever consider just compromising with them? Maybe putting up a smaller antenna that wouldn't be as visible? I did consider it, I admitted. But here's the thing. If I had compromised, it would have established that the HOA had the authority to regulate my antenna. That would have set a bad precedent, not just for me but for any other ham operator in that community. Sometimes you have to draw a line and defend it, not because you want to fight, but because the alternative is worse. The audience applauded, and several people came up afterward to share their own HOA horror stories. It seemed I wasn't alone in facing resistance from overzealous community associations. One woman told me about an HOA that tried to ban solar panels, claiming they were ugly. Another man described a years-long battle over a flagpole in his front yard. In every case, the HOA had eventually backed down when confronted with federal or state law, but not before causing significant stress and expense. Why do they do it? I asked Derek on the drive back to Phoenix. Why do HOA boards keep fighting battles they can't win? Because they're used to winning, Derek said. Most people don't have the time or money to fight back, so they comply even when the HOA is wrong. People like Barbara get addicted to that power. When someone finally stands up to them, they can't handle it. As summer turned to fall, life in Oakmont Hills settled into a comfortable routine. The new HOA board was competent and reasonable, focusing on actual community improvements rather than nitpicking enforcement of arbitrary rules. They repaved several streets, upgraded the neighborhood park, and organized community events that actually brought people together. I got to know Paul Rodriguez, the new HOA president, fairly well. He was a good guy who genuinely cared about the neighborhood. We had coffee one morning, and he apologized again for everything that had happened. I should have spoken up sooner, Paul said. I was on the board when Barbara first went after you, and I knew she was wrong. But I didn't want the confrontation, so I stayed quiet. That was a mistake. You're making up for it now, I told him. The changes you've implemented are exactly what the HOA needed. I just don't understand how she thought she could get away with the financial stuff, Paul said, shaking his head. The paper trail was obvious once someone actually looked. Nobody was looking, I said. That's how these things happen. People assume their leaders are honest and don't bother checking. It's a lesson for all of us. In October, I got a call from Robert Chen, my attorney. He wanted to let me know that our case had been cited in a new ruling from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Another ham operator in California had sued his HOA, and the appellate court had referenced Judge Morrison's decision in my case as persuasive authority. You're officially legal precedent, Robert said with a laugh. Congratulations. It was a strange feeling, knowing that my personal battle had become part of the legal framework that would protect other operators in the future. I hadn't set out to be a test case or a pioneer. I just wanted to enjoy my hobby without harassment. But sometimes, circumstances push you into a larger role. The FCC sent me a formal letter in November thanking me for my cooperation with their investigation and noting that my complaint had led to improvements in how they handled similar cases. Thomas Warren, the investigator, had apparently used my case to develop new training materials for enforcement staff. Amateur radio operators provide a vital public service, the letter stated. The Commission is committed to protecting the rights of licensed operators and ensuring that state and local authorities respect federal preemption in this area. Your willingness to stand up for your rights has made it easier for us to do our job. I framed the letter and hung it in my radio room, next to my license certificate. The holiday season brought unexpected goodness to the neighborhood. The HOA organized a Christmas light contest, and for the first time in years, people actually participated. Dozens of houses were decorated with elaborate displays, and families walked the streets in the evenings admiring the lights. It felt like a real community again, not just a collection of houses governed by petty rules. I put up lights myself, though nothing too elaborate. I wasn't trying to win the contest. I just wanted to participate, to show that I was part of the community despite everything that had happened. On Christmas Eve, I was adjusting my antenna when I noticed a car pulling into my driveway. It was Paul Rodriguez and his wife Maria. They were carrying a plate of cookies and a bottle of wine. "We wanted to thank you," Paul said after I invited them in, "not just for exposing Barbara's corruption, but for standing up to her in the first place. You showed the rest of us that it was possible to push back." "I didn't do it alone," I said. "I had a good attorney and support from the FCC. "Still," Maria said, "you could have just given up. A lot of people would have. The fact that you didn't made all the difference." We talked for a while about the neighborhood, the changes in the HOA, and plans for the coming year. It was nice to have neighbors who felt like friends rather than adversaries. After they left, I sat in my radio room and reflected on the past year. It had been stressful and expensive, but also rewarding in unexpected ways. I had learned about federal communications law, the court system, and my own capacity to stand up for what I believed in. I had made new friends in the ham radio community and earned the respect of my neighbors. Most importantly, I still had my antenna, and it was still connecting me to the world. As 2026 began, I set new goals for my radio hobby. I wanted to earn the DXCC award by confirming contacts with at least 100 countries. I wanted to participate in more emergency preparedness exercises. I wanted to mentor more new operators and help grow the amateur radio community. But I also wanted to stay involved with the HOA to make sure the reforms Paul had implemented stayed in place and that future boards remained accountable. I attended monthly meetings and even volunteered to serve on the Architectural Review Committee. Some people thought I was crazy after everything that had happened, but I saw it as taking responsibility for my community. In February, I received an email from a ham operator in Florida who was facing a similar dispute with his HOA. He had read about my case online and wanted advice. I spent an hour on the phone with him, walking through the steps I had taken and the resources that had helped me. I gave him Robert Chen's contact information and encouraged him to reach out to the ARRL for support. "Don't let them intimidate you," I told him. "Federal law is on your side, and there are people who will help you fight." He thanked me profusely and promised to keep me updated on his case. It felt good to pay forward the help I had received. In March, the Arizona Republic ran a feature story about HOA disputes and used my case as a prominent example. The article discussed the tension between private covenants and federal law, highlighting several areas where HOAs often overstep their authority. It was fair and well-researched, and I was pleased with how they presented the issue. The article generated a lot of response. I received emails from other ham operators, from people dealing with solar panel disputes, and even from someone who was fighting his HOA over a wheelchair ramp. It seemed that my battle with Barbara Henderson had struck a nerve with people who were tired of overreaching community associations. One email particularly stood out. It was from a law professor at Arizona State University who wanted to use my case in her property law class. She asked if I would be willing to come speak to her students about the experience. I agreed, and in April, I found myself standing in front of 60 law students, talking about HOA covenants, federal preemption, and the practical realities of fighting for your rights. The students asked smart questions and seemed genuinely interested in the subject. Several told me afterward that they hadn't realized how complex HOA law could be. "You should consider going to law school yourself," the professor joked as I was leaving. "You clearly have a knack for this." I laughed, but had to admit the idea was appealing. I had learned more about the legal system in the past year than I ever expected to know. Maybe there was a future in helping others navigate similar disputes. But for now, I was content with my day job at the data center and my nights spent on the radio, making contacts and building friendships across the globe. In May, exactly 1 year after Barbara's sentencing, I received a letter from her. It was postmarked from California and written in neat feminine handwriting on plain notebook paper. "Dear Mr. Vance," it began, "I want to apologize for everything that happened between us. I was wrong to try to force you to remove your antenna, and I was wrong about many other things as well. I let my position on the HOA board go to my head, and I lost sight of what really mattered. I'm not asking for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and I hope you're doing well. Sincerely, Barbara Henderson." I read the letter several times, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me was angry that it had taken her this long to apologize. Part of me was skeptical about whether she was truly remorseful or just going through the motions. But another part of me recognized that it took courage to write the letter at all, and maybe that meant something. I wrote back a brief response. "Thank you for your letter. I accept your apology. I hope you've learned from your mistakes and that you're building a better life for yourself. Regards, James Vance." I never heard from her again, and I was fine with that. Some chapters in life are meant to stay closed. As spring turned to summer, I continued to enjoy my hobby without interference. My antenna stood tall in the backyard, a symbol of both my rights as a citizen and my connection to a global community. On any given evening, I could flip on my radio and talk to someone on the other side of the planet, sharing stories and making friends. The neighborhood had healed from the drama of the previous year. Property values remained stable, proving that my antenna hadn't caused the economic disaster Barbara had predicted. In fact, several potential homebuyers specifically mentioned the strong community involvement and transparency of the HOA as selling points. Paul Rodriguez served out his term as president and was re-elected unanimously. He had proven himself to be exactly the kind of leader the community needed: competent, honest, and willing to listen. I reflected often on what the whole experience had taught me. I learned that standing up for your rights isn't always easy or cheap, but it's necessary. I learned that federal law exists to protect important interests, and that regulatory agencies like the FCC take their responsibilities seriously. I learned that corruption thrives in darkness, and that transparency is the best disinfectant. Most importantly, I learned that ordinary people can make a difference when they're willing to fight for what's right. I wasn't a lawyer or a professional activist. I was just a guy who wanted to operate a radio station. But by standing my ground and refusing to be bullied, I had changed my community for the better and created legal precedent that would protect others in the future. In June, I organized a ham radio demonstration at the neighborhood park. I set up a portable station and invited residents to come try making contacts. Several kids were fascinated by the equipment, and their parents asked thoughtful questions about how the hobby worked. 2 adults expressed serious interest in getting their licenses, and I gave them study materials and offered to help them prepare for the exam. One elderly woman, Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down, came up to me near the end of the event. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I was one of the people who thought you should just take down that antenna and stop making trouble. I didn't understand what it was all about. But after everything that came out about Barbara, I realized I was wrong. You were fighting for something important." "Thank you for saying that," I replied. "It means a lot." "How does this radio thing work anyway?" she asked, gesturing at my equipment. I spent the next 20 minutes giving her a basic explanation of amateur radio, how radio waves propagate around the globe, and the role ham operators play in emergency communications. She was genuinely interested, asking smart questions and making connections to things she had learned decades ago in school. "My late husband would have loved this," she said wistfully. "He was always interested in how things worked." "It's never too late to learn," I told her. "If you're interested, I can lend you a study guide." She smiled. "Maybe I will, maybe I will." As the sun set on that June evening, I looked around at my neighbors enjoying the demonstration, kids excitedly watching as I made contact with an operator in Japan, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was what community was supposed to be about, people coming together, learning from each other, and supporting each other's interests. The battle with Barbara Henderson and the HOA seemed like ancient history now, though barely more than a year had passed. The neighborhood had moved on, grown stronger, and learned important lessons about accountability and respect for individual rights. My antenna still stood tall in my backyard, unchanged except for the upgrades Derek and I had installed. It remained a symbol of perseverance and the importance of standing up for your rights, even when the fight seems overwhelming. I continued to operate my station regularly, participating in contests, emergency nets, and casual conversations with operators around the world. Each contact reminded me of why I had fought so hard to keep my antenna. This hobby connected me to something larger than myself, to a global community of people who shared a passion for communication and technology. The legal bills were eventually paid off, the stress faded, and life returned to normal. But I never forgot the lessons learned during those challenging months. I stayed involved with the HOA, attended meetings, and made sure that future boards understood the limits of their authority. I mentored new ham operators and shared my story with anyone facing similar battles. And every time I fired up my radio and heard the familiar static and signals from distant stations, I felt grateful. Grateful for federal protections that safeguard important activities like amateur radio. Grateful for organizations like the FCC and ARRL that support operators facing unreasonable restrictions. Grateful for good attorneys like Robert Chen who understand the importance of fighting for your rights. And grateful for a community that, despite the challenges, ultimately chose transparency and fairness over petty tyranny. The fight had been worth it, every stressful moment and every dollar spent. Because in the end, it wasn't just about a radio antenna. It was about standing up to bullies, protecting important rights, and proving that ordinary citizens can prevail when they're armed with the law and the courage to use it. Barbara Henderson had learned the hard way that federal law truly does trump HOA bylaws, and that lesson would resonate in Oakmont Hills for years to come.